They burned his cabin for fun. By dawn, they would learn the land remembers everything. Before the last ember settled into ash, Elias Boone was already awake, standing just far enough from the heat that the fire painted his face in flickers of orange and shadow, his boots planted in dry dirt that hadn't seen rain in weeks, the smell of charred pine, and old leather hanging thick in the night air while laughter faded down the hill where the riders had gone, careless and satisfied, as if they had done nothing more than kick over a lantern in an empty shed. He didn't chase them, didn't shout, didn't even move until the roof gave its final sigh and folded inward, sending a quiet burst of sparks into the black sky above the valley, the same sky he had watched alone for years, counting seasons by the way the wind changed direction and the cattle moved slower each winter. Elias Boone was the kind of man people in town spoke about without ever really knowing, a man who kept to himself, who traded rarely, who nodded once and said little, and that silence had made him a story others felt free to fill with whatever they pleased. Some said he was stubborn, others said he was hiding something, but most agreed he was no one important, just a lone rancher clinging to a patch of land too dry to matter, too far out to defend, too quiet to be missed. Tonight, that belief had turned into amusement for a group of men who owned more acres than they could ride in a day and thought ownership meant authority over anything that didn't push back. Elias watched the last beam collapse and only then stepped forward, the soles of his boots crunching softly over blackened wood, his eyes steady, his breathing slow, as if the fire had burned through something long before it touched the cabin. He bent once, careful, deliberate, brushing aside a layer of warm ash with the back of his hand until his fingers closed around something small, something that had not turned to dust like the rest. A thin cord, darkened but unbroken, with a small stone at its center that caught the faintest trace of moonlight even through soot. He turned it in his hand, just once, then closed his fist around it, the gesture. So quiet it might have meant nothing to anyone watching, if anyone had been watching. But out beyond the ridge, past the dry creek bed and the line where scrub gave way to open land, the night carried more than smoke. The wind shifted, subtle, almost polite, and somewhere in the distance a horse lifted its head, then another, the sound too far to be called a warning, too steady to be chance. Elias straightened slowly, his silhouette framed by the last glowing remains of what had been his home, and for a moment he looked not at the ashes, but toward the horizon, where darkness held its breath. He slipped the cord into his pocket without ceremony, then turned away from the ruin, not with defeat, not with anger, but with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing something others do not. The ground beneath his boots was the same ground they had ridden across laughing, the same land they believed they owned because paper said so, and fences marked lines they trusted. But land out here had older memories than ink and wire. And as the night thinned toward morning, carrying with it the faint rhythm of distant hooves moving with purpose rather than haste, the silence around Elias Boone began to feel less like isolation and more like the pause before something long owed finally came due. By first light, the valley looked smaller than it had the night before, as if the fire had taken more than wood and walls and left behind a silence that pressed in from every direction, and Elias Boone stood where his doorway used to be, a tin cup in his hand filled from the last of the water he had saved in a barrel that somehow survived, the metal warm against his palm as he drank slowly, not because there was little left but because there was no reason to rush anything anymore, the horizon, stretching out in pale gold and dust while the faint tracks of horses marked a careless path across his land, heading back toward the town where men like Carter Whitlock believed distance was protection and ownership was permanent. Elias set the cup down on a flat stone and looked over what remained, not searching for what he had lost, but measuring what had not changed, the slope of the ground, the line of fence posts leaning like old men who refused to fall, the dry creek bed cutting through the far end of the property like a scar that had never healed, and for a moment it might have seemed to anyone else that nothing here was worth fighting for, nothing here could justify the trouble it brought. He stepped forward, boots pressing into ash that still held the memory of heat, and crouched again, running his fingers through the gray dust until it thinned enough to reveal the packed earth beneath, solid and unchanged, and that was where his gaze stayed, not on the ruin above it but on the ground itself, as if he was listening to something buried deeper than sight. A breeze moved through, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant water, and Elias lifted his head slightly, just enough to feel the direction of it against his face, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion but in recognition, the same way a man recognizes a voice he has not heard in years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the cord he had saved, the small stone now cleaner where his thumb had brushed it through the night, its surface marked with lines too precise to be accidental, too worn to be new, and he held it there in the morning light without reverence, without hesitation, just long enough to confirm it was still whole. In town, Carter Whitlock was already awake, standing on the wide porch of his two-story house with a cup of coffee in his hand and a view that stretched over land he believed was his by right and by record. His men gathered below talking in low voices about the fire, as if it had been a clever story rather than a choice, their laughter quieter now but not gone, because to them nothing had changed, a cabin gone, a stubborn man removed, an inconvenience handled without consequence. Whitlock listened, nodding once, his expression calm, assured, the kind of calm that comes from never having been proven wrong in a way that mattered, and when one of the younger men asked what they would do if Elias stayed, Whitlock only smiled faintly and said that men like Boone did not stay long after losing everything, that pride burns faster than timber, and the land would be clear by the end of the week. Back on the ridge, far beyond the line of Whitlock's fences, a different kind of movement had begun, quiet and deliberate, riders spaced with intention rather than chance, their horses stepping in rhythm that carried no urgency yet wasted no time, and though the distance still hid them from view, the pattern of their approach followed no road drawn on paper, only paths known to those who understood the land as something living, something that answered not to ownership but to memory, and as Elias Boone stood alone in the remains of his cabin, the morning growing brighter around him, he did not look toward town, did not look for help or for witnesses. He simply turned his body slightly toward the open valley, as if aligning himself with something already on its way. The sun had climbed higher by the time the first shape appeared at the far edge of the valley, not a cloud, not dust, but something that moved with intention, slow and steady, the kind of movement that did not belong to wandering cattle or passing traders, and Elias Boone saw at the moment it broke the line where earth met sky, his eyes narrowing slightly as if confirming what he had already expected rather than discovering something new. He did not reach for a weapon, did not call out. He simply stood with his weight balanced and his shoulders relaxed, the same posture he had carried through storms and long winters, the kind that made a man look smaller than he was until it mattered that he was not. The figure became 2, then 5, then more, the count growing not in chaos but in pattern, each rider spaced with a purpose that turned distance into formation, their horses moving without rush, hooves landing soft against the dry ground as if even the land had agreed not to break the silence too soon. The breeze shifted again, carrying the faint scent of leather and sage, and with it came a sound that was almost nothing, a low rhythm that settled into the air rather than cutting through it, steady enough to be felt before it was heard, and Elias lifted his chin just slightly, not in challenge, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. Back in town, Carter Whitlock stepped off his porch with the confidence of a man who believed the day would unfold exactly as planned, his boots clean, his hat set just right, and his men already preparing their horses with the easy chatter of those who expected no resistance, their talk circling around fences to be moved, lines to be redrawn, and how quickly the land would look different once Boone was gone, as if land itself could forget who had stood on it the longest. One of them glanced toward the open plains, squinting at something too far to name, but Whitlock did not follow the look, not yet, because nothing in his world had ever required him to question what he already owned. Out on the ridge, the riders continued, now close enough that the shapes of their hats and shoulders became clear, their lines stretching wider than the narrow trail that led down into the valley, as if they were not arriving from one direction but from many, converging on a point that had been decided long before the fire was ever lit. At their center rode a woman whose posture carried no need to prove anything, her gaze fixed ahead, her presence quiet but undeniable, and though her face was still too distant to read, There was something in the way the others held their distance from her that marked her as more than just another rider. Elias reached into his pocket again, not hurried, not uncertain, and let the small stone rest against his palm, his thumb brushing its edge once before he closed his hand around it. The gesture simple but final, like the last word in a conversation no one else had heard. The ground beneath him felt steady, unchanged, and yet the air had shifted, the silence now carrying weight instead of emptiness, and as the riders drew closer, their numbers now impossible to ignore, Elias Boone did not step forward to meet them, did not step back to avoid them. He simply remained where he was, in the space where his cabin had stood, as if that place, even in ruin, was still exactly where he was meant to be when the land decided to answer. The riders did not slow until the distance between them and Elias Boone could be measured in breaths instead of miles, their horses stepping into the valley. As if they had crossed that ground many times before, though no trail marked their path and no fence line guided their approach, and still not a single voice rose above the steady rhythm of hooves meeting dust. The line widened as they came, not to surround, not to threaten, but to hold the space with quiet certainty, their presence stretching across the land in a way that made the burned remains of the cabin feel smaller, less like a loss and more like a marker, a point where something had been crossed. Elias did not move from where he stood. The ash beneath his boots settled now into a dull gray that carried no heat, his eyes fixed forward, watching as the riders came to a stop one by one, each horse stilled with a light pull of the reins, each man and woman sitting straight in their saddle, their faces calm, unreadable, as if they had arrived not for conflict but for something already decided. At their center, the woman rode the final few yards alone, her horse stepping carefully over the uneven ground where chard would still lay scattered, her gaze lifting to meet Elias without hesitation, without question, and in that moment the silence shifted again, no longer empty, no longer waiting, but full, as if every breath carried meaning that did not need to be spoken. She brought her horse to a stop and remained seated for a long second, studying him the way one studies something familiar that has changed with time, her expression steady, her posture balanced between authority and restraint, and then she dismounted in one smooth motion, her boots touching the ground with a softness that seemed to match the way the riders had approached, deliberate, respectful, certain. Elias slipped his hand from his pocket, the cord now visible between his fingers, the small stone catching the morning light, and he held it there without raising it, without offering it, simply letting it exist between them like a quiet answer to a question that had not yet been asked. The woman's eyes dropped to it for the briefest moment, and something in her expression shifted, not surprise, not doubt, but recognition that ran deeper than either, and she took a single step forward, closing the space just enough to make the distance intentional rather than accidental. Behind her, the riders remained still, their presence neither pressing nor retreating, the line they formed now less a boundary and more a witness to what stood at its center. From the far side of the valley, a faint echo carried, the distant movement of other horses, smaller in number, louder in intent, and Elias did not need to turn to know who approached, the careless rhythm already familiar, already out of place against the quiet order that had settled here. The woman lifted her gaze from the stone back to Elias, her voice low when she finally spoke, not raised to carry, not shaped to persuade, but clear enough to be heard exactly where it needed to be. "You kept it." The words were simple, but they landed with weight, as if they held years within them, and Elias gave the smallest nod, not as an answer but as acknowledgement, his voice just as quiet when it came. "It was never mine to lose." The wind moved again, brushing past them both, carrying dust and the faint scent of smoke that still lingered, and the woman's eyes shifted past him for a moment, toward the open land behind, as if measuring something unseen, before returning to him with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. "Then you know why we are here." Elias did not look at the riders, did not look at the horizon where the other men would soon appear. He only looked at her, the corner of his mouth tightening just enough to suggest something between understanding and acceptance. "I figured the land would answer." The woman's gaze held his for one more breath, and in that silence, the meaning settled fully into place. not as a threat, not as a promise, but as something older than both, something that did not need to be explained because it had already begun. The sound reached them before the riders came into full view, uneven and louder than it needed to be, the kind of approach that carried confidence without awareness, and Carter Whitlock crested the low rise with 4 men behind him, their horses kicking up dust that drifted forward ahead of them like a careless announcement, their laughter fading as soon as they saw what waited. In the valley below, it was not fear that stopped them at first, but confusion, the kind that slows a man down when the world does not match what he expects, and Whitlock pulled his reins tighter than necessary, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat as he took in the line of riders stretched across land he believed he owned, their stillness more unsettling than any raised weapon could have been. He let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had found the right place to land, then nudged his horse forward a few steps, his men following with less certainty now, their earlier ease replaced by something quieter, something that had not been there when they rode out of town. Elias Boone did not turn to face them fully, did not shift his stance to acknowledge their arrival. He remained as he had been, angled toward the woman beside him, as if the men behind him had already said everything they needed to say the night before. Whitlock stopped 10 yards out, close enough to see the ash on Elias's boots, the remains of the cabin scattered behind him, and the small circle of riders that now defined the space in a way no fence ever had, and for a moment he said nothing, his gaze moving from Elias to the woman, then beyond her to the others, counting without meaning to, measuring without understanding what he was measuring against. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but thinner than it had been on his porch, the confidence still there, but no longer effortless. "I do not recall inviting company." The woman did not look at him when he spoke, her attention still on Elias for one more second before she turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge that another voice had entered the space, her expression unchanged, her posture untouched by his presence. "The land does not wait for invitations," she said, her tone even, carrying no challenge, no need to raise itself above the quiet around them, and the words settled into the air in a way that made Whitlock's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. He shifted in his saddle, adjusting his grip on the reins, his eyes returning to Elias with something sharper now, something closer to irritation than confusion. "You have made your point, Boone. You lost your cabin. That is unfortunate. But this is still my land." Elias let the silence sit for a breath before answering, his voice low, steady, without weight, but not without meaning. "It never was." Whitlock's expression changed then, not dramatically, not enough for his men to react, but enough that the certainty behind his eyes flickered, just once, and he leaned forward slightly in his saddle as if proximity might restore control. "I have the papers. I have the lines drawn. I have paid for every acre you are standing on." The woman took one step to the side, not to stand between them, not to block anything, but to align herself with the space itself, her gaze now fully on Whitlock, her presence quiet but unyielding, and when she spoke again, her words did not rise, did not press, they simply landed where they needed to. Paper does not speak for what came before it. The wind moved through again, softer now, carrying dust that brushed against boots and hooves alike, and behind her the riders remained as they had been, still, silent, their presence no longer a question but an answer waiting to be understood. Whitlock's grip tightened again, the leather of his reins creaking faintly, and for the first time since he had arrived, he glanced past the woman, past Elias, toward the wider line of riders that stretched farther than he had first seen, their number now clear in a way that made counting useless, and something in his posture shifted, not surrender, not yet, but recognition that the ground beneath him was no longer as simple as it had been when he rode out that morning. Whitlock opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, the words catching somewhere between certainty and doubt, and for a moment he looked not at Elias, not at the woman, but at the ground beneath his horse's hooves, as if expecting it to offer him the same quiet agreement it always had, but the earth remained still, unchanged, offering nothing back. The woman stepped forward just enough that the light shifted across her face, revealing eyes that held neither anger nor forgiveness, only something steadier, something that had been waiting longer than any of them had been alive, and when she spoke again, her voice did not rise, but it carried further than before, reaching not just Whitlock, but the men behind him, the riders beside her, the land itself. "This ground was walked before your fences were drawn," she said, each word placed carefully, not to convince, but to remind, and Whitlock's jaw tightened as he straightened in his saddle, forcing a small breath through his nose, as if that alone could restore the shape of things. "I paid for it," he repeated, quieter now, but more insistent, as though repetition might turn belief into truth, and Elias shifted his weight slightly, the ash beneath his boots giving way to packed dirt, his eyes never leaving Whitlock's face. "You paid for lines," Elias said, his tone even, without challenge, without triumph, just a statement that did not need support, and the words seemed to land heavier than they should have, settling into the space between them like something that could not be brushed aside. Whitlock's gaze flickered again, this time toward the riders, counting without counting, the number now undeniable, the silence around them pressing in with a weight that no argument could lift, and one of his men shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking softly, the sound louder than it should have been in the stillness. The woman reached into the fold of her garment and drew out a small object, something wrapped in worn cloth, and she held it without raising it high, without displaying it like proof, simply letting it exist where it could be seen, and Elias's eyes dropped to it for the briefest moment before returning to Whitlock, his expression unchanged. The cloth was unwrapped slowly, revealing a piece of parchment, aged and marked with lines that had faded but not disappeared, the edges worn from time rather than use, and Whitlock leaned forward slightly, his gaze narrowing as recognition struggled to find its place. "This was drawn before your deed," the woman said, her voice steady, "and it carries agreement that your paper does not erase," and Whitlock's fingers tightened again around the reins, his knuckles paling beneath the leather as he stared at the markings, not fully understanding them, but understanding enough to feel something shift beneath his certainty. "That is not recognized," he said, but the words came slower now, less certain, and Elias let out a small breath, not quite a sigh, not quite relief, just the sound of a man who had waited long enough to no longer need to push. "It does not need to be," Elias answered, and the wind moved again, carrying the faint rhythm of hooves from beyond the ridge, more riders, more presence, the number growing in a way that made counting meaningless, and Whitlock's gaze lifted toward the horizon, then back again, his posture no longer fully settled, his certainty no longer whole. The woman folded the parchment carefully, returning it to its cloth, not with urgency, not with finality, but with the quiet confidence of something that did not depend on being seen to remain true, and when she looked back at Whitlock, her eyes held him there, not with force, but with something deeper, something that left no room for misunderstanding. "You were not asked to know this," she said, "but you are here now," and the silence that followed was not empty, not waiting, but complete, the kind of silence that leaves a man alone with what he understands and what he can no longer ignore. Whitlock shifted in his saddle again, but this time the movement was not subtle, his boot pressing harder into the stirrup as if he needed something solid beneath him, something that would not change under the weight of what he was beginning to understand, and his eyes moved once more across the line of riders, not trying to count them anymore, but trying to measure what they represented, and finding no clear edge to it. One of his men leaned slightly closer, his voice low, almost careful, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention they no longer wanted, asking what this was supposed to be, but Whitlock did not answer, not because he did not hear, but because there was no answer that fit the shape of what stood before him. Elias Boone remained where he was, the ash and dirt beneath his boots now settled into something firm, something that no longer carried the memory of fire but held the quiet weight of what came after. And he watched Whitlock not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with the same steady calm that had marked him from the beginning, as if this moment was not a victory, but a conclusion long expected. The woman stepped forward one more time, not closing the distance completely, but enough that her presence stood clearly between Whitlock and the rest of the land behind Elias, her posture straight, her hands relaxed at her sides, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a finality that did not need to rise to be heard. "You came here believing this place was empty of anything that could answer you," she said, and Whitlock's gaze snapped back to her, something sharper now, something that pushed against the calm he had been losing piece by piece. "It was empty," he said, the words coming quicker than before, almost defensive, as if saying them might restore their truth. But the woman did not react to the tone, did not meet it with force. She simply held his gaze and let the silence follow his words settle into something heavier. "Empty does not mean unclaimed," she answered, and the riders behind her shifted almost imperceptibly, not in threat, not in preparation, but in agreement, their stillness deepening rather than breaking. Whitlock's hand moved slightly, not toward anything, but enough that the leather of his glove brushed against his coat, a small, uncertain motion that betrayed more than any raised voice could have, and his eyes flicked once toward Elias again, as if searching for something there, some sign that this was a game, a bluff, something that could be undone with the right words. But Elias gave him nothing, only that same steady look, the kind that did not push, did not demand, but did not move either. "You burned what you thought was only wood," the woman continued, her tone unchanged, and now there was something else in it, not anger, not accusation, but a quiet statement of fact that carried its own weight, and Whitlock's jaw tightened again as he held her gaze, unable now to look away, without acknowledging that something had shifted beyond his control. "The land does not forget who stands on it," she said, and the wind moved again, softer this time, carrying with it the faint sound of more hooves in the distance, the presence growing without needing to be seen, and Whitlock's shoulders dropped just slightly, the first sign that the certainty he had carried into the valley had begun to give way to something else, something slower, heavier, something that could not be dismissed with paper or lines drawn across a map. One of his men cleared his throat quietly, the sound breaking against the silence and falling flat, and Whitlock did not look at him, did not acknowledge the question that hung unspoken, because the answer was already here, already surrounding him in a way that made any argument feel smaller than it had just moments before. Elias shifted his weight once, just enough to turn slightly toward the open land behind him, his gaze following the line of riders that stretched beyond sight, and when he spoke, his voice was as steady as it had always been, carrying no triumph, no edge, only truth. "This place was never waiting for you to take it," he said, and the words settled into the air like something final, something that did not need to be repeated, and Whitlock, for the first time since he had arrived, did not answer immediately, his silence stretching longer than any he had allowed before, as the land around him held its ground without needing to move at all. Whitlock finally drew in a longer breath, the kind a man takes when he realizes speaking will not change what stands in front of him, and his eyes moved once more across the riders, not searching for weakness now, but searching for an end, a boundary, something that told him where this presence stopped, and finding none, his shoulders settled lower, the tension no longer held as tightly as before. The men behind him shifted again, quieter this time, their earlier confidence gone entirely, replaced by the simple awareness that they had stepped into something they did not understand, and one of them slowly pulled his horse half a step back without thinking, the small movement unnoticed by anyone but himself, and yet echoing louder than any word spoken. Elias Boone watched it all without change, his posture the same, his hands relaxed, the small stone still resting in his palm, and there was no satisfaction in his eyes, no claim being made, only a calm that came from knowing he did not need to take anything back because nothing had been truly taken from him to begin with. The woman remained where she stood, her gaze steady on Whitlock, her presence unyielding but not pressing, as if giving him the space to arrive at something on his own rather than forcing him toward it, and the silence stretched long enough that even the wind seemed to pause before moving again across the valley. Whitlock's fingers loosened slightly on the reins, the leather no longer pulled tight, and when he spoke this time, his voice carried less weight, not weaker, but stripped of the certainty it once held. "What is it you expect?" he asked, the question simple but different from anything he had said before, not a challenge, not a demand, but something closer to an admission that he no longer set the terms. The woman did not answer immediately, her eyes holding his for a moment longer before she turned her gaze slightly toward the land itself, the stretch of earth behind Elias, the open space that had drawn all of them here, and when she spoke, her words were quiet, measured, and without any need to rise. "We do not expect," she said. "We remember," and the statement settled into the space between them like something that had been waiting far longer than any of their choices. Whitlock swallowed once, the motion small but visible, and his gaze followed hers for the first time, not looking at the riders, not looking at Elias, but looking at the land itself, the dry soil, the uneven ground, the place he had measured in acres and value, and for a moment it looked different to him, not owned, not empty, but held in a way he had never considered. He let out a slow breath, and the decision came not with a gesture, not with a command, but with a quiet shift in his posture, his shoulders settling as if something heavy had finally been set down. He turned his horse slightly, not fully away, not yet, but enough that the direction was clear, and his men watched him closely now, waiting not for instruction, but for confirmation that what they were beginning to feel was real. Elias did not move, did not acknowledge the shift, because there was nothing to confirm, nothing to win, only something to be left as it was. The woman stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but making space again, her role in the moment complete without needing to be declared, and the riders behind her remained still, their presence unchanged, their silence holding steady, like the land itself. Whitlock glanced once more toward Elias, and for a brief second there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not respect fully formed, not apology spoken, but the beginning of understanding, the recognition that some things are not taken by force or claimed by paper, and that realization did more than any confrontation could have. He gave a small nod, almost to himself, then turned his horse fully this time, the motion slow, deliberate and final, and one by one, his men followed, their departure quieter than their arrival, the dust they raised lighter, less certain, as if even the ground beneath them had changed its mind about how firmly it would carry them. And as they rode away, the valley did not react, did not shift, it simply remained, holding the silence once more, but now it was a different kind of silence, one that no longer waited to be filled. The valley did not rush to fill the space they left behind, and neither did Elias Boone, who stood a while longer in the quiet that followed, his eyes resting not on the road where Whitlock and his men had disappeared, but on the ground at his feet, the same ground that had held fire, footsteps, and now something steadier than both. The riders remained for a time, their line unbroken, their presence no longer a barrier but a witness that had seen what it came to see, and the woman stood at the center of it all, her gaze moving once across the horizon before returning to Elias, as if measuring whether anything more needed to be said. He opened his hand slowly, the small stone resting in his palm, its surface clean now where ash had once covered it, and he looked at it not as something kept, not as something owed, but as something that had done its work simply by remaining. He stepped forward once, closing the small distance between them, and held it out, not offering it back, not returning it, but placing it in the space between them where it had always belonged. The woman looked down at it, then back at him, and for the first time, something softer passed through her expression, not a smile, not relief, but recognition that did not need to be spoken aloud. "You kept the promise," she said quietly, and Elias shook his head just slightly, his voice low, carrying no claim. "I just did not break it." The wind moved again, lighter now, carrying the scent of open land instead of smoke, and the riders behind her shifted almost imperceptibly, their purpose complete without ceremony. One by one, they turned their horses, not in unison, not by command, but with the quiet understanding that the moment had reached its end, their departure as steady as their arrival, leaving no mark that could not be carried by memory alone. The woman remained a second longer, her eyes holding Elias with the same calm certainty she had brought with her, and then she stepped back, her hand closing gently over the stone as she turned, mounting her horse in one smooth motion, her posture unchanged, her presence already becoming part of the distance. Elias watched as they rode out, not following, not calling after them, simply letting the space return to what it had always been, open, quiet, and honest in a way that required no witness. When the last rider disappeared beyond the rise, The valley settled fully, the silence now complete, no longer waiting, no longer holding anything back. Elias turned then, finally, toward what remained of his cabin, the scattered wood, the blackened edges, the outline of something that had once been shelter, and he walked to it without hesitation, without urgency, kneeling once more in the ash, not searching for what was lost, but clearing space for what would come next. He set the first piece of unburned wood aside, then another, his movements slow, deliberate, each one placed with care rather than force, the kind of work that does not begin with rebuilding, but with understanding what still stands. Far off, where the road curved back toward town, a single figure paused on horseback, Carter Whitlock looking back one last time at the land he had believed was his, and though the distance swallowed detail, the shape of his posture had changed. The straight line of certainty softened into something less certain, something that would follow him longer than any boundary he had drawn. Elias did not see him, did not need to, because whatever had passed between them no longer required witness or acknowledgement. It simply remained, settled into the ground like something that had always been there, waiting for the moment it would no longer be ignored. The sun climbed higher, the light stretching across the valley, touching the earth, the broken wood, the open space where the riders had stood, and Elias Boone kept working, one piece at a time, not rebuilding what was, but shaping what would stand next, his hands steady, his movements quiet, and in the stillness that followed, the land held no memory of fire, only the quiet truth that some things, once revealed, do not need to be defended again.